Which Nintendo Switch games are destined to return as Nintendo Switch 2 editions? This is, to be fair, a topic I have addressed extensively prior to the Switch 2 April Direct. The other month, I posted this video listing 20 candidates for Switch 2 games that could get, essentially, Switch 2 editions. I also should note this video from the end of last year talking about what I called Plus games and discussing the many benefits these kinds of titles represent for Nintendo. However, given my past attention to both topics, I thought it was time to revisit the topics together, given that we now know that this is indeed going to be a major plank of the new system strategy. Therefore, in this video, I will spend some time going through every major first-party Nintendo Switch game, and we're going to look to see which games could be rejuvenated for another tour of duty, and if so, how, and if not, why not? In case anybody is in any doubt about how important the Nintendo Switch 2 edition strategy is to Nintendo though, let's just recap. At launch there are two Switch 2 originals. One, the diminutive Switch 2 Welcome Tour, and two Nintendo Switch 2 edition games in Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. In July, we have one Switch 2 exclusive, Donkey Kong Bonanza, coupled with one Nintendo Switch 2 Edition Plus game in the perplexingly polysyllabic Super Mario Party Jamboree Nintendo Switch 2 Edition Plus Jamboree TV. There is no confirmed Switch 2 original game for August, but with Dragon Drive due for Switch 2 sometime in the summer, it's likely that they will keep up the one-for-one matching by the time Kirby and the Forgotten Land Nintendo Switch 2 Edition plus Starcross Road launches, and I, for one, would not bet against them continuing to match this pace of roughly one Nintendo Switch 2 Edition per month. Metroid Prime 4 and Pokémon Legends ZA will already count for 2 out of the remaining 4 months of 2025, and I've discussed elsewhere my expectation that the Super Mario Bros. 40th anniversary celebration will include Plus versions of prior titles. Not only does this strategy mean that at launch Nintendo can offer roughly twice as many games for sale on their system as prior consoles, but it also means that they can continue to draw attention to their Switch games. Every advertisement for Super Mario Party Jamboree is good for both Switch and Switch 2 owners, while still emphasizing that there are new and better experiences to be had on Switch 2. This also helps fans feel that, as they've already invested in so many games which have Nintendo Switch 2 editions, it would only make sense to upgrade in order to see the overhaul of those existing titles. And of course, those digital upgrades won't have retailer cuts, so Nintendo sees more of that profit directly. Alongside games which will have discrete Nintendo Switch 2 editions, Nintendo has also announced a small list of titles that will receive free performance patches but won't presumably be given Plus game overhauls, at least in the immediate future. I will discuss each game a little more later in the video, but the list is ARMS, Captain Toad Treasure Tracker, Super Mario Odyssey, Super Mario 3D World plus Bowser's Fury, Clubhouse Games 51 Worldwide Classics, Zelda Link's Awakening, Zelda Echoes of Wisdom, Game Builder Garage, New Super Mario Bros. U Deluxe, and Big Brain Academy Brain vs. Brain. Issuing this list now clearly doesn't preclude them patching other games or even adding Plus game add-ons later on to these titles if and when they decide to sell a Nintendo Switch 2 edition, but it's a rather curious list with titles ranging from 8 years old to barely 8 months old by the time the Switch 2 launches. However, the fact is that Nintendo has an absolutely vast back catalogue of Switch games, and anyone could potentially make for an exciting return. It's not like Nintendo is afraid to do deep cuts with this after all. They only gave Mario Kart 8 Deluxe the Booster Course Pass half a decade after Mario Kart 8 Deluxe launched, which in turn was released 3 years after the original Wii U title came to market. Re-releasing a game like this is the new version of the ports that kept the Switch afloat during the lean year of 2018. It is a way to bolster sales of the original, boost attention to it, and to fill a slot in what could otherwise be a sparse lineup if they suffer delays or other problems with providing sufficient titles. it's beneficial for Nintendo in other ways too. Not every game needs to be a vast 120-hour epic experience, and we've seen Nintendo be actually rather innovative with their Plus titles before, with examples like Super Mario 3D World plus Bowser's Fury, where the additional game is actually one of my favourite 3D Mario experiences, as well as the Game Boy Advance classic, The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past plus Four Swords Adventures, where they built a whole new multiplayer game off of an existing classic. This is also of great help for when they need to take that much longer to develop a new game in a series. Of the 8 Zelda Universe titles for the original Switch, 3 were remakes or remasters. Basically, I don't think these Nintendo Switch 2 Edition titles are going to be peripheral to the Switch 2 strategy. I think we are looking at something far more comprehensive and basically an effort to rejuvenate as many Switch games as possible for the coming generation. All this in mind, I thought it would be worth looking through the entire Switch first-party lineup to see if we can sort out those titles which could have Switch 2 extensions and those which may be just a hazy memory for players. But before we do, let's look at the criteria we are dealing with. Nintendo aren't going to hit the port button on everything that moves, but it is very much in their interests to have as much of their back catalogue as possible presentable, not as an aged relic of the past, but as a fit version for their current console. That can be achieved, though, quite unobtrusively through the eShop, where you can easily download titles from this generation and generations past. So really, the only reason to care about bringing titles back, just for the sake of having them to hand, is that you want physical copies to go out. This means we really need to think about which titles we expect them to want to have sitting on the shelves of retailers, which titles will continue to sell at a trickle indefinitely and make the kind of whim purchases that make Nintendo's Christmas seasons so successful. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that they all need to be gonzo sellers. The first tranche of games they've chosen clearly were, and I think they will use these titles as a metric against which to judge the potential of future Switch 2 editions. What percentage of people upgrade and with what kind of incentives? What kinds of people double dip just to own a Switch 2 version physically? What is the effect on sales compared to the baseline over the past few years? Clearly, all this will depend on the age of the title, but with Breath of the Wild and Super Mario Party Jamboree, they have an incredible range to examine in terms of age. Based on this, I would expect that they would deduce which games might benefit from a Switch 2 version, and I suspect therefore that new Plus games will start being commissioned later this year, meaning that as late as 2027 and 2028, we could still be seeing a goodly pace of Plus game titles. Now, in theory, most games could receive an upgrade if that upgrade is easy to achieve and would provide a brief sales spike, but I think the real issue is the physical copies. I could see Nintendo considering going down the route of making some games Switch 2 editions digital only as a solution. Take titles like Another Code Recollection or Advance Wars 1 plus 2 Reboot Camp. If it's possible to shine up those graphics, then it would clearly be worth offering that game, especially if Switch 2 titles sell at a slightly higher price. Problem is, if they're only going for a small print run of the games, it could be an expensive folly, at least by Nintendo standards. We've had even quite big games be digital only before. Advance Wars was digital only in Japan, and the original Famicom Detective Club remakes were digital only in the West. So it seems a logical step to me to have some titles be digital only Switch 2 upgrades. It just depends on where they draw that line. Also, there are some games that fall into that murky middle ground. They're the kind of titles that Nintendo might want to do something more extensive with, so they don't want to empty the options box by boosting it across just yet, but it's not necessarily a top priority. Games like Paper Mario the Origami King or Pokémon Mystery Dungeon feel like this. Popular enough to be worth doing something, but not successful enough for that to feel like a top priority. I expect these are the titles that may be left on the shelf for the longest. Anyway, without further ado, let's go through every significant Switch title from the first-party publishers to see what their long-term fate could be. I'm going to go through the games broadly chronologically, except where there are games with sequels or different editions on the same system, and then I'll cover them all together. While I usually give forecasts a percentage weighting, it's trickier with circumstances like this where we're potentially talking about the whole life of the system, so I will do specific forecasting at the end, and right now start with the very beginning. Well, actually, Zelda Breath of the Wild already has a Nintendo Switch 2 edition to its name, so let's move on to Switch 2's other famous launch game. 1-2-Switch and Everybody 1-2-Switch. Both are currently only compatible with Switch 1 Joy-Con. In theory, there is a chance that one or both of these could get a Switch 2 edition where they make specific changes to make them work with Switch 2. These titles weren't amazing sellers and they're casual affairs which could easily be redeveloped to incorporate Switch 2 specific features later on. Recall also that Switch 2 producer Kawamoto was also responsible for the team that produced 1-2-Switch. That said, I suspect they would rather do a 1-2-Switch 2 at some point, utilizing the raft of new features and slowly cannibalizing old 1-2-Switch minigames into the new one as time goes by. The same sort of approach we've seen with Mario Party, Mario Kart, Splatoon and others, where old tracks, courses and stages return as new for the updated titles. Let's move on to the other Switch 1 launch title, Snipperclips. Although a digital-only game at launch, there was a physical edition in the autumn of 2017. I thought this was a really interesting game, and if they bolted new content onto it, then it might be worth a second run out. All that said, I think a physical edition would probably be quite a limited run given how niche the franchise is and how many other titles are out there. All things considered, I think a full Snipperclip sequel is the likelier way to see the Snipperclip saved from the waste paper bin. Mario Kart 8 Deluxe. How hilarious would this be? Truly, it would become the game that never dies. However, as huge as Mario Kart 8 Deluxe is, I think it will remain firmly eclipsed by Mario Kart World for a long, long time to come. I just can't see a major rationale for this one to ever return except possibly right at the end of the Switch 2's life when Mario Kart World is about to drive off into the sunset and a new game is about to replace it. In that final year of the Switch 2, if they can sell a whole new generation of world players who never experienced Mario Kart 8 Deluxe on a classic of yesteryear as a salve to those who can't yet afford the brand new console that Nintendo are cooking up, it might be worth it to do a Nintendo Switch 2 edition. If this were the case, I would expect just a graphical touch-up in the main, although perhaps some characters, costumes and features that had become popular in World might make a return to Mario Kart 8 Deluxe. If you can return to an earlier game, that is, I guess. Okay, let's have a look at EPD9's other major title of 2017, ARMS. Again, this is a game where the developers clearly had such a burning passion for the title as they were making it, yet the fact that it's been given a free graphical patch suggests that they're not immediately looking to add content to it, to which I say, good. I really would love to see a full ARMS sequel, and with a franchise like this, I think a new game or a plus game is an either or proposition. The lack of a plus game, which would have been an obvious route for them, essentially the inverse of what EPD9 teams did on Switch, where they gave us a deluxe version of Mario Kart 8 alongside an original game in ARMS. To have an original Mario Kart World and a deluxe edition of ARMS would be a kind of justice, I guess. To me, this therefore bumps it up to at least a 50% chance that we will see an ARMS return announced in the next 2 or 3 years. But there is another option, which is what I call the Pikmin strategy. Drop ARMS Switch 2 Edition Plus extra content onto Switch 2 a couple of years out from a full new game to raise the profile of the franchise and whet the appetite of players. In this case, they may decide that their ARMS Resurrection strategy is a few years off, and so there's no need to hold off on allowing the players the joy of Switch 2 quality ARMS gaming. And besides, this may encourage people to return to the title. If they were truly determined to abandon it, I doubt they would bother with even this level of support. Okay, let's look at Splatoon 2 and 3. I'm going to do both of these together. Splatoon 2 feels like a no, as there is, of course, Splatoon 3. A Nintendo Switch 2 edition of Splatoon 3 is a very interesting possibility raised a while ago by friend of the channel RZB. Check out his channel, by the way, it is awesome. I feel like there is a very narrow window of time when that would have made sense, and although it's rapidly passing, it's not yet closed. You see, Splatoon is a big and successful franchise, especially in the Japanese middle school scene. But the thing about Japanese middle schoolers is that they tend to grow up. And so much like Pokémon, I think the company is acutely aware that they need to refresh the game on a regular basis. The question is whether they have the capacity to do this, and while I've deep dived separately the Splatoon and Animal Crossing development groups EPT5, and I'm broadly optimistic that they can and will ultimately separate into a completely independent pair of groups, much as Nintendo's entire software line originated as the R&D4 video game development team back in the 80s. If they need a stopgap game, and I know much of the feeling after Splatoon 3 is that they could use a bit of a breather to ensure the next title is a real slam dunk, then a Nintendo Switch 2 edition of Splatoon 3 could be a great announcement for, say, a June Direct, and would nudge the franchise along for perhaps another 18 months, allowing for 2027 to see the grand return of Splatoon, matching the 5-year gap between Splatoon 2 and Splatoon 3. On the other hand, if they have a title in the works for 2026, and without Animal Crossing distracting their attention, I think that is quite plausible. Splatoon 3 Nintendo Switch 2 edition feels like it would be more likely to split the audience than help it. I think it's unlikely, but if there is any chance, I expect it to release by March of 2026 at the latest, and probably before Christmas. Before moving on from this, as a quick addendum, I posted this script onto Patreon, and one piece of feedback that I think deserves consideration is this from Ollie, who says, "It's flown pretty much under the radar, but in November of last year, legitimate references to new weapons were found in the game's files, added months after new content ceased. Also, and this is just my speculation, but there's a big gateway to the east of the main hub that doesn't serve a function right now and has some major construction work going on behind it. And suspiciously, it's blocked off using the same barrier asset once used to deter players from the train station before it became an access point for the expansion pass content. Could just be me looking too deep into things, but I don't think this barrier has been used anywhere else in the game, and the positioning of the gate feels perfect for a major new DLC mode." End quote. It wouldn't be the first time that a Nintendo game has appeared to tease DLC that never came. Remember the extra island on the map of Mario Odyssey, or the extra modes plural in Super Mario Maker 2, but nevertheless, this would seem to provide a decent opportunity to give Splatoon 3 another lease of life. At any rate, let's move on to some other 2017 highlights. Mario plus Rabbids Kingdom Battle and Mario plus Rabbids Sparks of Hope. Will Ubisoft re-release these games? Heck yeah. Ubisoft, especially in their current near-destitute state, are by all reports rather partial to money. However, with Davide Soliani having gone, I wonder how good a port this will be, and I expect it to be simply a graphical sharpening. Indeed, since it would be an Ubisoft game, they may eschew the Nintendo Switch 2 edition labeling entirely and just decide to do their own complete edition of the games, and therefore when I get to my roundups, I won't really talk further about this one, even though I think it is a high, perhaps 70% chance we will see one or both titles regurgitated by the end of 2027. Pokken Tournament. I feel like this game is in with a fair shout of a sequel, with the Bandai Namco team responsible's last title being New Pokemon Snap quite a while ago now in 2021. However, Bandai Namco have lots of things on their plate, and perhaps this game doesn't merit a sequel outright. The sales were seemingly okay, but not exactly world-defying, and the Pokemon company seem readier than Nintendo to cut loose concepts that don't quite find an audience out of the gate. Under these circumstances, though, a Pokken Tournament Director's Cut Plus game, while odd sounding as an expansion of a revision, could actually make quite a bit of sense. Remember that being a deluxe game didn't stop Mario Kart 8 Deluxe from receiving an expansion in 2022. It would nurture the title for another generation. A tiny outcrop of crests under the mainline series Big Oak Tree, sure, but if it keeps the game in the catalogue for another decade, it should be a solid return on investment. This also strikes me as a good shout for the series' 30th anniversary in 2026, where doubtless they will want to have a robust Switch 2 lineup of Pokemon games. Fire Emblem Warriors and Fire Emblem Warriors 3 Hopes. The first Fire Emblem Warriors game feels unlikely to me to return in the near term, but could be a nice extra for perhaps the 40th anniversary in 2030 if they do a really good job of building up the Fire Emblem franchise in the next few years and they're looking for something to flesh out the lineup. Fire Emblem Three Hopes, though, does feel like a prime candidate to me to return, since the original unusually did not receive DLC, and Koei Tecmo are usually happy to see their games remastered quite liberally. Recall how Hyrule Warriors Definitive Edition arrived on Nintendo Switch relatively early in the second year on the market. Furthermore, while this is something I'll go into with another video, I think there's a decent chance that Nintendo could want to create a bit of an air quote moment around Fire Emblem at some point in the future. They did this notably with Pikmin in 2024, where they had Pikmin Bloom and Pikmin 3 Deluxe ahead of time, plus Pikmin 1 plus 2 accompanying Pikmin 4 and a whole host of advertising in Japan. Fire Emblem feels at least as ripe for a major push, especially given the potential of the property in Japan. But with Super Mario Bros., Zelda, and Pokémon all having major anniversaries in the next year, the calendar is looking rather crowded, and I could see Fire Emblem's moment not tied to an anniversary, but more towards a point when they just see fit to promote it. For example, around a potential Switch 2 Lite console release in 2027 or 2028. At this point, a Three Hopes expansion could, like Hyrule Warriors Definitive Edition before it, be a nice extra for that period. Super Mario Odyssey. In the short term, this is a clear no, as they have already confirmed a free glow-up on Switch 2, which actually looks quite impressive. The next 3D Mario game won't be far off, and Super Mario Odyssey is going to be a distraction at this point in the Switch 2's life cycle. On the other hand, in the medium to long term, Odyssey still seems like such low-hanging fruit. We have always expected Odyssey DLC because it just seems like such an easy one to expand, and yet it never came. I do expect them to do a mid-gen Mario title, much as they did with Super Mario 3D World plus Bowser's Fury, and although Super Mario Galaxy 2 seems like a game with greater potential for expansion, especially if Rosalina becomes a feature of a future Super Mario Bros. Movie, Odyssey can't be ruled out either in the long term. Xenoblade Chronicles 2. This is a stunning game, but one that did clearly struggle graphically on the Switch, not least because the developers were liberally poached to get Zelda Breath of the Wild and Splatoon 2 out of the door in 2017. I also think it's incredibly unlikely to receive any kind of Nintendo Switch 2 edition at all. If you follow the sequence of Monolith Soft's definitive editions, then Xenoblade Chronicles is the clear next candidate for a do-over, probably circa 2030. If this is the case, I suspect it would be far more comprehensive a graphical overhaul than a Nintendo Switch 2 edition would provide for, and would be sold as a full-price game. By then, 13 years after the original, and with a game that muddles a more niche experience that has given its devotees often hundreds of hours of gaming pleasure, I guess there won't be too many complaints, at least by the standards of such things. As for the other Xenoblades, Definitive Edition, 3 and X Definitive Edition, I would say all would make a lot of sense for Switch 2 editions. They are absolute classics, and in most cases Monolith Soft have already kind of perfected them mechanically, so graphical tweaks would be sufficient to bring them forward to a new generation. Since the Switch 2 entered development in 2019, it seems likely that all the recent games were made in the knowledge that a more powerful hardware might be called to run these games in the future. Xenoblade Chronicles X especially is so utterly stunning on Switch that the thought of a Switch 2 version is truly magnificent. The question is whether such Nintendo Switch 2 editions are paced out given the size of the games, or whether they try to do a Xenoblade moment and drop a bunch all at once. Given that they dropped the Nintendo Switch 2 editions of Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom on the same day, such a move might seem in keeping, but these are far bigger titles, and so they can expect that significant numbers of people will either go for the more famous one, Breath of the Wild, or the one they don't own yet, Tears of the Kingdom. I'm not sure the same assumptions hold true for Xenoblade Chronicles, where there will be more people who simply have not owned a prior Xenoblade title before. It also depends to a certain degree on Monolith Soft's schedule and whether they see more potential in a fuller remake for some of these. I think at minimum some kind of multiplayer expansion of Xenoblade Chronicles X using game chat functionality feels like a low-hanging fruit and possibly a good way to draw extra attention to a title somewhat eclipsed by the Switch 2 announcement straight after its launch. Bayonetta 1, 2, and 3. Given the changes at Platinum recently, Bayonetta has to have a question mark over it. Logically, these could wait until or unless they decide to revive Bayonetta, whether for a fourth title or perhaps just for a plus game for Bayonetta 3. I think a graphical uplift of Bayonetta 2 and Bayonetta 3 at some point would make sense, but it's one of those announcements that might just be dropped into some random direct in the middle of 2028. Bayonetta Origins may be more likely than the others because it's just more recent and presumably the team is still around. A short add-on to justify a re-release would make a good deal of sense, and since there's unlikely to be a sequel to this, I guess sooner would make the most financial logic. Kirby Star Allies. A slightly unloved Kirby game that released probably too early in its development cycle, likely in desperation to fill a slot on Switch, and which was filled out later through DLC, but only after its reputation was tarnished with initial mediocre reviews. HAL loves redoing old games, and this seems like a low-hanging fruit, especially since its install base is far lower than Forgotten Land, and the potential has to be there for it to be developed further. I doubt it's the top of anybody's priority list, but there will come a year which is otherwise quiet for Kirby releases, where this will be a very welcome opportunity for HAL. Then again, as long as they have the development capability to keep the Switch 2 audience in ports of old titles, I suspect there are more promising examples of games such as Kirby Planet Robobot, Triple Deluxe, and Kirby's Epic Yarn, which might keep Star Allies grounded for the foreseeable future. Hyrule Warriors Definitive Edition and Age of Calamity. I've talked about this separately, so I won't go into it much here, but Age of Calamity feels like a very natural game to bring over to complement the three existing Wild games on Switch 2, and while it might seem like a crazy fanish hope that they bolt on a Plus game to give us the Breath of the Wild universe take on the Age of Calamity, these Warriors titles seem designed to promote fanish hopes, so I won't give up the concept just yet. With a Zelda movie on the horizon, Hyrule Warriors Definitive Edition could also make a lot of sense in time, but maybe less of a development priority, as I suspect there will be other potential Warriors titles to create anew in due course. Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze. I called this in a previous video and I'm doubling down. I know it sounds mad on the surface to bolt a new Plus game onto a port of an 11-year-old title, but look at the scope of Donkey Kong Bonanza and consider how much effort Nintendo is clearly putting in to rejuvenating the Donkey Kong brand. Now, either Nintendo gets a new game on its feet, plausible but unlikely given that Retro have been Brinstar deep in Metroid Prime 4 for a long time now, or they do a Plus title and rejuvenate Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze, a title that is far and away the series' most critically successful modern incarnation of Donkey Kong Country to date. Sooner or later, therefore, I do expect this one to make an appearance, and if they want to press the Donkey Kong moment after Bonanza, I could see this being a 2026 or 2027 title. Donkey Kong Country Returns HD, though, I think that one was truly an afterthought, and I don't expect to see it back. Mario Tennis Aces. I will cover this with Mario Golf Super Rush and Mario Strikers Battle League. I think it's likely that we will get new versions of each of these, with the possible exception of Battle League, which was so woefully underfeatured that it seemed time to receive what I would consider to be the rest of the game, but which they might class as the Switch 2 edition. However, I have examined sporting options for Mario in a separate recent video. Suffice to say, I think new versions are far more likely than special editions, even for dear old Battle League. Sushi Strikers, The Way of Sushido. I mean, I guess it could come back. I really don't know enough about it to say, but it seems like the kind of title that probably people slept on previously, and they might see potential in getting another time with it in the sun. But why not make a new game at this point rather than bolting onto an old one? Captain Toad Treasure Tracker. This is another title clearly beloved of EPD8, the Mario 3D team, and they have added to it so often with the Switch and 3DS expansions and the DLC added to the Switch version in 2019. Plus, they had Wii U exclusives for 3D World that never came over. The fact that it's receiving a free graphical uplift for Switch 2 suggests that they aren't looking to expand it immediately, though, and it may just be one that they want to position for the Mario anniversary by giving it a bit of a glow up and shoving it out the door. Using the same logic as with ARMS, though, a new game is possible, but this may be a higher effort proposition than the team necessarily have time for, given how much Mario and Donkey Kong content they have apparently in the pipeline. Ho ho. If not for the free uplift, I would give this game a shot, but for now, I think it's a sequel or nothing. Next, Super Mario Party, which I'll cover with Mario Party Superstars from 2021. Super Mario Party is the biggest selling Mario Party game ever up to this point. Of course, they'll want Jamboree to take that spot in due course, but I do think Super Mario Party has a lot of potential. That said, they make Mario Party games quite frequently, and at this point I suspect both Mario Party and Mario Party Superstars will remain Switch 1 titles, and they'll just lift out popular minigames for future Switch 2 titles. Jamboree's Nintendo Switch 2 edition seems to me very much an exception, since it was clearly designed from the start to bridge the generations, but I don't think we can expect party games to change their approach in general, and so I think Jamboree TV will remain the only Nintendo Switch 2 edition of a Switch. Mario Party. Pokémon. Let's just do all the mainline ones together. Would the Pokémon Company re-release new versions of old games? Gee, let me really dig in here and think. Yes, with the 30th anniversary just round the corner, it makes perfect sense to me that they could rejuvenate any and all of these titles. On the other hand, I don't think a modest graphical uplift is something they're going to be all that bothered about, and they may in fact use Pokémon Legends ZA as a way to explore the relative popularity of the two versions before they make any future decisions. Reports suggest that Scarlet and Violet, air quotes, may have updates which suggest that the titles will try to patch over their issues by leaning into the Switch 2's power, but won't really be given that much TLC. As to the rest of their library, if only to get Switch 2 versions of their games on shelves for when the Switch is no longer around, I could see a lot of Pokemon games ultimately making the jump. Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee has that Gen 1 nostalgic goodness, so I reckon it's one with potential, although any expansion feels like it would be more of the Zelda notes scale. Pokémon Legends Arceus is a critical darling though, and a Switch 2 edition might make a very attractive game to drop in a year when they don't have a retail Pokémon to offer customers, although not anytime too soon, with ZA still to promote. Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl are deeper cuts, and I suspect they won't be prioritised, but eventually I guess could come over, especially given the absence of Platinum content from the 2021 ports and how quiet Ilk have been on the poker front since then. As for Sword and Shield, they may feel it's worth saving that for a bigger do-over a generation or so hence, but I suspect they would rather be selling the game on Switch 2 in the meantime than waiting for that rainy day. Keeping to the 3 yearly schedule on Pokémon titles has hurt Pokémon, with Scarlet and Violet receiving particular criticism. But the fact is that the company relies on that revenue stream and are unlikely to tilt too far away without a backup plan. Being able to leverage these classic titles by reviving them on Switch 2 is a fantastic opportunity, especially for a series like Pokémon, which has a constant stream of young players entering the marketplace. They can do 4 yearly mainline games with the DLC the following year, 4 yearly Legends games, and 4 yearly Switch 2 editions, and still have a really strong and robust lineup with games in pretty much every holiday season. Here's the big one then, Super Smash Bros. Ultimate. I've got a whole video on this, although that was before we knew Sakurai was working on Kirby Air Riders. The baseline expectation should probably be that Sakurai will want a ground-up new Super Smash Bros., in which case Super Smash Bros. Ultimate will be left to quietly disappear into the backdrop. Also, the way Nintendo are doing these Nintendo Switch 2 edition games, while far more consumer friendly than just new editions replacing the old ones, makes the scope for a new Super Smash Bros. Seem to me to be far less. Would they add on to the base game but still ask people to pay additionally for the DLC? It's potentially very confusing. Clearly now, if Sakurai were to be working on the project, it wouldn't just be for a Nintendo Switch 2 edition, but for some ultimate version of Ultimate, or of course a new Super Smash Bros. Entirely. The lack of a polished up version of Super Smash Bros. Ultimate, when the major evergreens like Breath of the Wild and Super Mario Odyssey received attention day one, might also be evidence that a new Smash is in the offing, although to be fair, it's likely this is just because Sakurai is focused on other things right now. As I said previously, the longer we go without seeing Super Smash Bros. Ultimate, the more likely a full new version becomes, and I now think an original Smash this generation feels like at least a 70% shout, even though Kirby's Air Riders makes it seem likely that the next game could be at least a couple of years away. New Super Mario Bros. U Deluxe. Another game that seems like it would be ridiculous to do on Switch 2 editions, and yet it's one of those games that just sells and sells and sells. Ultimately, I feel they've moved on from the new line, and while a Super Peach U adaptation to complement the Luigi U might make sense as a tie-in for a movie, I don't think this is the way Nintendo will operate. However, the obvious title for this treatment, as I've discussed in other videos, is Super Mario Bros. Wonder, and as much as I think there will be another 2D Mario in due course, I don't think we'll be waiting 12 years this time. Super Mario Bros. Wonder has plenty of life in it yet, and being able to promote it for both Switch and Switch 2 fans seems locked in. Yoshi's Crafted World. This is a tough one to call. Developers Goodfeel haven't tended to stick to one franchise, but they have worked on Kirby, Wario, Yoshi, and Princess Peach. But Yoshi is one of those franchises I think Nintendo wants to build up, especially with a new movie coming up. I've always assumed Woolly World as a port would be their best shot at this. Woolly World, after all, was one of their better received Yoshi games. But then again, giving Crafted World a makeover and some extra content feels like low-hanging fruit, particularly if years down the track they want to create a bit of a Yoshi moment and drive attention to that series. If that's the case, they don't really have a lot of other choices, and developers Goodfield tend not to stick with the same kinds of properties too long, having handled Kirby, Wario, Yoshi, Princess Peach, and their own original IP over the last 15 or so years. Crafted World may not be legendary, but it was okay, and given that it's aimed at younger audiences, it makes sense to do just redoing old titles that fret too much about constant streams of new ones. Therefore, I see Yoshi's Crafted World as having a decent potential for return, but maybe not for quite a few years. Let's move on to Super Mario Maker 2. Controversial one, this. I do think the team will do something more with this game, but I think it will be more in the vein of Super Mario Maker's original inspiration, Mario Paint. Super Mario Maker 2 feels like it could be expanded comfortably, and it would defer that terrible day where all the existing levels people have lovingly crafted get switched off. I do think a Nintendo Switch 2 edition of Super Mario Maker 2 is a better chance, therefore, than it might superficially appear. I just can't quite figure out how or where they would position it. Frankly, given that they're trying to push mouse mode, if they were to do it, then this year might be a great moment with the Mario anniversary. I expect Super Mario Bros. Wonder to return, but why not bring back Super Mario Maker 2 at the same time? In terms of likelihoods, it's an odd one to try and predict. The longer it doesn't return, the more certain I will be that it will get a full sequel, unless we get to the console's midlife, at which point I think a plus version of the current game to remind people the series exists, even if they're not planning to return to it in this console generation, becomes more likely again. At the moment, another Maker game, much as I adore the franchise and would love to see a further full entry, probably is not in Nintendo's immediate consideration, especially with EPG-10 having Super Mario Bros. Wonder DLC likely in development, and then new Pikmin and another 2D Mario to consider. With Super Mario Maker 2 possibly having underperformed, they may feel that they would do better trying another big push than doing a flat-out new game. Fire Emblem Three Houses and Fire Emblem Engage. There's really no reason not to give these games a bit of a makeover, even if the Nintendo Switch 2 editions are essentially just complete versions featuring DLC. Adding full-fledged new content feels a bit of a reach, but may be possible, especially to Three Houses, which, while I personally liked it far less than Engage, was clearly well received. Fire Emblem is overdue a new title though, and I think at some point in the next few years they're going to want to try to re-engineer a bit of a moment for it, so I guess that these will stay in the vault for a while and possibly release together during a point where they want to make a major push for Fire Emblem. Astral Chain. I haven't deep dived Platinum Games, but reportedly all is not sunshine and rainbows over there, which makes me think an Astral Chain Switch 2 edition might be an easier reach than a full sequel, albeit with the potential for another version later down the track if the first does well. Shades of Bayonetta 1 plus 2, presaging Bayonetta 3's entry many years later. Zelda Link's Awakening. I can't tell you how much I adore this game, but apart from fixing some of the stutter, which they seem to already be doing via free updates, it's not immediately clear to me how you would improve on it, although I would like it if you could map the controls to more than just the right Joy-Con. Echoes of Wisdom also has a free upgrade, and so I think we can assume that neither of these 2D Zelda games are due anything more from Grezzo in the near term at least. Ring Fit Adventure. I've talked more about this in another recent video. Yes, a Nintendo Switch 2 edition of Ring Fit Adventure seems likely and perhaps necessary, but it depends on whether they're close to a whole body camera fitness title, which may take priority. Luigi's Mansion 3 and 2 HD. Again, I've talked about this one in a separate video. If Luigi's Mansion 3 gets a plus game, which in itself seems a bit of a reach, I would expect it either this year as a placeholder until Luigi's Mansion 4, or right at the end of the console's life once Luigi's Mansion 4 has had a good run out. It's likely, therefore, that we will know one way or the other sooner how likely it is to see Luigi's Mansion 3 before we see a new Luigi's Mansion title for the Switch 2. Dr. Kawashima's brain training for Nintendo Switch. It seems like it would just be simplest to just do a sequel, but then again, I don't know how much there is really in this game to justify a sequel. In fact, the name already suggests that there will be a sequel since they just call it Brain Training for Switch 2. Considering that this is quite a casual title, where physical editions are likely to be quite useful, I'm going to say that yes, I would expect it to come back, and potentially therefore with a Switch 2 edition of the game. Tokyo Mirage Sessions. This is a great example of the kind of niche franchise where a limited run, or perhaps even digital-only Switch 2 edition, might make a fun headline in a direct and might attract a bit of attention to a game that otherwise didn't really trouble the scorers. A lot will depend on if they can build enough interest around Fire Emblem and perhaps whether they still have contact with developers Atlas. I don't think it's going to be on anyone's priority list, but the likelihood has to trend up from 0 now to a little higher than 0 over the long term, even if it's just to remind people that Tokyo Mirage Sessions exists. Pokémon Mystery Dungeon Rescue Team DX. Anything physical that's in the Pokemon space makes sense for a potential revival, but there are so many Pokemon games that could be upgraded that this has to be a very low priority, especially with this game seeming to have underperformed and the future of the series seeming to be in doubt. I guess it's the sort of title where a small new mode could be added inexpensively, and given that Pokemon has a stronger reach for a young audience, some of whom won't have been alive for the prior title, a Plus game does seem like a way to keep the franchise alive without fully committing to a new title. Animal Crossing New Horizons. Another one that seems like a lock-in for a sequel as opposed to a new version. One of the most surefire games on this list not to get anything Nintendo Switch 2 related as far as I can see. Clubhouse Games. Now, Nintendo have already given this game a free graphical uplift, and I expect this is so they can continue to promote the Switch version for a couple of years yet, since it will appeal to that system's increasing proportion of casual players while still having an offer for new players. After that, though, where do they go? On the one hand, they could just do a sequel title. I think they'd need to break the glass ceiling of 100 worldwide classics to justify a full sequel, probably 101. I'm sure Nintendo's deep knowledge of types of play, they should be able to find enough titles to fill 101 slots though. Without substantially more than 51 worldwide classics, I think a new game would feel just a bit odd, since it would essentially just replace the previous title. Therefore, there is leeway to do a Nintendo Switch 2 edition, though since the first game was a $40 offering, and so if they made a $70 or $80 Switch game, then the profit margin would be similar to just doing a sequel flat out. On balance, though, I'd say a sequel is the way forward for this particular franchise. Paper Mario the Origami King and Paper Mario the Thousand Year Door. Paper Mario games are relatively niche, but I think they were interested in doing something with the Thousand Year Door by reviving it. It didn't quite have the same sales splash that perhaps they hoped for, but it feels to me like a perfect opportunity to do a Plus game re-release, experimenting with returning to that classic Paper Mario formula. As for the Origami King, although it was decently received, certainly compared to the last few Paper Mario titles, I'm not sure people are really clamoring for more of that title, and I can't see much happening with it until or unless they do, I don't know, a Paper Mario TV show or something like that. My feeling is that during the Mario anniversary, these games could be given a Nintendo Switch 2 graphical uplift, but not full new versions. Pikmin 3 Deluxe, Pikmin 4, Pikmin 1 plus 2. Pikmin is one of the franchises that they are trying really hard to boost. 1 plus 2 would not benefit from being brought over, but Pikmin 4, a game that felt designed around the potential of DLC and where Arlo noticed there was some promo art featuring an icy world despite no icy level being in the game, well, that game seems perfect for a Plus game, and it would help mark time until a full original new title could be put out. Pikmin 3 Deluxe, I am less sure about. I think they'd like to have it on shelves, but it doesn't really make sense to add much to it. Perhaps they could build in some integration with Pikmin Bloom or something like that if they really wanted to see it on shelves. However, I suspect with Pikmin 5 likely afoot, the need for Pikmin 3 to have a Switch 2 version will be far less. Super Mario Bros. 3D World plus Bowser's Fury. Now, what do they do with this one? Make a plus game? I wouldn't rule it out entirely, but for now, it's been given a free patch, and I suspect that will be the last bit of tinkering the title will see, at least for the Switch 2 era. New Pokemon Snap. Like Pokemon Tournament, this would make sense for either a new version or a Plus game, and it is of course made by the same Bandai Namco team. As it's relatively niche as a title, a Plus game might be the better way to keep the property ticking along without such a major time investment. If they put such a title out for the Pokémon 30th anniversary next year, Nintendo can probably still be selling it for nearly a decade to come, and so it would make sense financially, even if Pokémon Snap is not the most lucrative of the Pokémon franchises. Famicom Detective Club. This is tricky since the original duology only had a physical release in Japan. I don't think Emiya will get a Plus game, but a revision that allows mouse mode seems quite possible, though they may save this for a while, as I expect they will be keener to push a new Famicom Detective Club sometime around 2027, and at this point it might make sense to capitalize on the Famicom Detective Club hype by releasing mouse mode enabled versions of the prior games. As for the original titles, there would be a certain amount of sense in doing a port of the Lost Memories in the Snow title from the Satellaview, but it seems so lost that Sakamoto appears to have forgotten all about it in a recent interview, and so I can't really see it as a Plus game. Adding a third port and putting out a 3-pack of games as a Switch 2 edition is, I guess, just about plausible, but my instinct is, sadly, that this is unlikely. As with Emio, though, a graphical revision and a mouse mode revision feels more plausible, if only in the long term. Miitopia. With Tomodachi Life due in 2026, I doubt this will be an immediate priority, and there is always a chance that if they do a sequel, perhaps leveraging game chat and the Nintendo Switch 2 camera all that much more, they won't need to bring back Miitopia itself. Having said that, as with any casual title, having a physical edition on the current system is probably good business sense, so from 2027 on, I could see this being reissued with plus content, assuming there is not to be a Miitopia 2. Game Builder Garage. The title already is receiving an update, and I don't see that a plus game would really benefit it. I think this game is remaining as it is for the foreseeable future. Zelda Skyward Sword. It seems that developers Tantalus would have developed Skyward Sword knowing that a graphically more powerful system was soon to be on the cards. I also think Nintendo will want a fairly significant Zelda game to be available in Nintendo Switch 2 packaging in the long term. The big question to me is whether there is potential for a $10 upgrade. I would say on balance no, and I think it will just get minor tinkering and be announced and put out at some point as a footnote, perhaps around a Zelda Anniversary Direct. WarioWare Get It Together and WarioWare Move It. This franchise suits not remasters and ports, but simply the best microgames being recycled into new titles. Move It might benefit from some accommodations to work with Switch 2, but the potential benefit of this isn't immediately apparent given that these are low-cost, low-margin games, so I reckon the odds of either of these games returning feels low. Metroid Dread. Oh, this is a fun one. I think Sakamoto is likely working on the next Metroid even now, and Mercury Steam have Samus Returns in their back pocket, which is surely overdue a port, especially if they want to make a far bigger deal of Metroid in the Nintendo Switch 2 era. I think the fans of this series are very likely to buy an upgrade pass if made available, but I don't think Nintendo could get away with charging for purely graphical changes, especially since the Nintendo Switch 2 will lose the benefit of the OLED screen, which so massively complemented Dread's gorgeous darks. Therefore, my suspicion is that we will get a graphical overhaul for this game at a $10 markup, but it will be for when or if there is an OLED model Switch 2 mirroring the original OLED launch, just like Breath of the Wild returned to accompany Switch 2's launch. Whether it comes with Metroid Notes or something else that I can't even imagine, I don't know. I think there are lots of interesting things they could do with this kind of thing actually, but that's a topic for another video. Big Brain Academy, Brain vs. Brain, and Switch Sports. Both of these seem like the kind of titles where they would just do sequels. Okay, though we're starting to race through these later years because we're getting more repeat franchises that I've already dealt with, so let's move on to 2023. Metroid Prime Remastered. A graphical uplift in the style of Metroid Prime 4 seems like such an obvious move. Whether they add anything to it, I actually doubt. I guess the $40 price tag means that they could potentially do Metroid Prime Trilogy for $80, but this seems phenomenally unlikely, as redoing Metroid Prime 2 and 3 would be a huge and expensive endeavour, and it's not like those games have quite the same unblemished reputation as the first Metroid Prime. So I do expect something, but not plus content, I'm afraid. Advance Wars 1 plus 2 Reboot Camp. If you hadn't caught on, I low-key love Advance Wars, but I'm not enormously optimistic that this franchise will get any further attention in the short or even medium term. Its first launch was pretty abortive for understandable reasons, and I don't think they're overly keen to return to it. Having said that, if they're not going to do a full new Advance Wars title, and I fear they won't, there is one saviour that may well slide into view, and that is the mouse mode functionality. Adding mouse mode functionality alongside even a very cursory upscaling would be a decent way to give this title a second time in the sun. They didn't release a physical edition in Japan, and maybe they won't release a physical version anywhere this time out, but even if it's just available on the eShop as a lure for the PC strategy fans keen to try out a legendary Nintendo classic, it makes sense to give it the Switch 2's most exclusive feature. It's even possible, fantastically unlikely mind you, but just barely conceivable, that in the long wait for it to be released, Nintendo and WayForward already decided to spend a few months working on the Switch 2 version so that they had a way to give this unfortunate title the second shot in the sun that they knew it would need. After all, by 2022, I'm sure they knew mouse mode was on the cards for the Switch 2 system, and they must have realised that Advance Wars release would not be a smooth one, and perhaps giving it a second chance in the sun later on would have been a good strategy to employ. Detective Pikachu returns. I don't feel like the audience of this game are likely to be too bothered about graphics, but it seems to take creatures forever to do these games, and so a short mode tacked on for a Switch 2 edition seems like a potentially good way to rejuvenate it and put it out on the console. Super Mario RPG. A graphical glow-up, possibly for free, seems likely to be announced around the Super Mario Bros. 40th focus. A Nintendo Switch 2 edition would probably be very welcome for Square Enix, since it would guarantee the game greater prominence in the medium term. I guess the real question is, would there be scope for a Plus game that could be a toe in the water of another Mario RPG series? With Paper Mario and Mario and Luigi, the plumber already feels like he's got the genre rolled up, but with the question mark over the fate of Acquire, and with Super Mario RPG selling well, and additionally with Square not exactly having the best of runs lately, I do see some scope for Square to do more with this series. The difficulty is that the remake devs Arte Piazza are remake specialists, but there's no sign I can see that they are equipped or even interested to lead a full new version of a title. Also, while its retro look was quite sweet at the time, I'm not sure I see it working for a new generation. I think if we don't see a visual upgrade confirmed this year, an add-on becomes more likely, but still relatively unlikely overall. It could be that this is just one game that never really gets revisited. Another Code Recollection. Another title that would obviously suit mouse mode and went fairly under the radar. I doubt this will be a priority for anyone, but it depends on the future of the series. If it did well enough to justify a sequel, I wouldn't expect them to return to another code before then, but more likely to me is that they will do a minor upgrade, enable mouse mode, and keep it on the Switch 2 to sell at a trickle through the next generation. Mario vs. Donkey Kong. This is another title that would really suit a Plus game, since Nintendo Software Technology has a long history of Mario vs. Donkey Kong games, and there must be a fair amount they can reutilize. It also was priced as a lower price game, meaning that they could get away with a more substantial add-on and release it as a $70 Nintendo Switch 2 game to sell indefinitely on that system as just one of Nintendo's near endless supply of Mario evergreens. Princess Peach Showtime. I've talked a lot about this elsewhere, but yes, I fully expect a Plus game for this, and probably by the middle of 2026 to coincide with the Super Mario Bros. Movie. Endless Ocean Luminous. Although Nintendo published this, it's really Arika's baby, and given that it was received relatively poorly, I don't see this one coming back anytime soon. Also pointless to redo, to my mind, Nintendo World Championships NES Edition. I just don't really see what a Switch 2 version of a game dedicated to Famicom titles would really achieve. Which leaves us, as yet uncovered, Mario and Luigi Brothership. I have talked about this elsewhere, and I do think there is a shot at a plus game for this title, given that, like Jamboree, it was positioned at just the right time to bridge two holiday seasons, and it features those famous movie stars, the Super Mario Brothers. There's also a huge history of Mario and Luigi titles and plus games. If it doesn't come soon, then I think it will be something they save for far later in the Switch 2's life as a way to rejuvenate the title as new, but even then I think there is always going to be a chance that Jamboree could get a plus game return. And all of this brings us fully up to date. Let's try to draw together all of these conclusions then. Before the end of the financial year, I think 90% we can expect to see at least one more Mario Plus title, almost certainly Super Mario Bros. Wonder, and a 70% chance we see at least two, Princess Peach Showtime being my tip, but Mario and Luigi Brothership, Luigi's Mansion 3, Paper Mario The Thousand Year Door, and Mario vs. Donkey Kong all being decent chances as well. I also consider Xenoblade Chronicles X getting a Nintendo Switch 2 edition 90% likely before the end of 2028, and the fact that they haven't announced it yet, while a little strange given it's their current title, is probably just to give the game its own moment in the sun when they re-announce it. Then there are a whole bunch of titles which would make sense depending on the status of their sequels. Pikmin 4, Another Code, Advance Wars, Bayonetta 3. And beyond that, there are series where I can see new versions being added at convenient moments to promote those series. The Pokémon, Fire Emblem, Metroid, and Famicom Detective Club titles particularly. I'd say there is a 90% chance that we will see at least one Nintendo Switch 2 Plus game in 2026, and a 70% chance that we will see two or more. Some are right out, Animal Crossing New Horizons, and almost certainly Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, except for one very weird long-term option. And quite a few are low priorities for now because the audience is probably still going to be sticking to Switch for the immediate future. This may well be the case with Pokémon, and I suspect Fire Emblem games may be seen the same way. Still, Nintendo will hope that this console generation is a long one, and with that in mind, I feel there's a 90% chance that we will still be seeing Nintendo Switch 2 editions beyond 2026 as a great way to help Nintendo pace out their game release schedules. For more in-depth takes specifically on Mario and Super Smash Bros. Ultimate, do check out these videos on screen and consider checking out the Patreon below. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.